99, Senator Kamlager. Madam Secretary, please read.
Assembly Constitutional Amendment 3 by Senator Kamlager, an act relating to involuntary servitude.
Senator Kamlager, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and good morning, Mr. President and members. Today, I rise to present Assembly Constitutional Amendment 3, which would remove the exception clause from Article 1, Section 6 of the California Constitution. This amendment is long overdue. Last week, with a unanimous roll call, we all supported the Juneteenth resolution. And as we work to recognize this history in states and cities across the country and federally, I hope you were able to celebrate Juneteenth in your district and its meaning, freedom and emancipation from slavery. But slavery is still alive and well and nicely packaged in the form of involuntary servitude, which as defined is a constitutional term for a person laboring against their will to benefit another under some form of coercion. California is a plantation state. We, along with 20 other states, including Alabama, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, and Mississippi, have exceptions to involuntary servitude in our state constitutions. And that is what ACA 3 is looking to eliminate once and for all from our state constitution, which is a document of guiding principles and values. The Constitution is a document of guiding principles and values. Many of you have come to talk to me about this, and you have shared your issues with the potential economics of this amendment and with its implied operational implications. And that is something that I cannot argue against, because yes, this amendment may cost some money, just like other amendments. And the cost may not be commensurate of its return in value, just like our constitutional right to freedom of speech in the press, just like our constitutional right to a speedy trial, our right to be tried by a jury of our peers, to not be subject to unreasonable search and seizure of our property, person, or papers, to freely exercise religion without discrimination, and to not be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process. Those rights are also in the Constitution, and those rights also cost money to protect and uphold. Additionally, the Constitution does not spell out how these rights are implemented or operationalized. That work is left to this body and to local jurisdictions to legislate. And I believe the alternative to not having those amendments, to not having those rights in our Constitution, is a cost that we cannot measure. I also want to remind you, members, that this is a proposed constitutional amendment. Proposed because if passed off this floor, California voters would weigh in on November for our election. ACA 3 asks that you let the voters decide what principles and values matter to them. Ultimately, they would decide whether or not to amend the state constitution to simply read, slavery and involuntary servitude are prohibited. This is about reclaiming dignity as an inherent birthright. It is that simple. And I believe our voters should have the opportunity to make that decision. I respectfully ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Senator Glazer.
Thank you, Mr. President, members. It's uncomfortable for me to rise at this moment to speak about a bill that in so many ways the values I certainly hold deep in my heart. First, I want to recognize the Senator for Los Angeles for her passion for civil rights, for equity, for the humane treatment of those that the state incarcerates after they're convicted of crimes committed against their fellow Californians. Slavery was an evil that will forever be a stain on the history of our great country. Thank goodness we eliminated it through the Civil War and the adoption of the 13th Amendment. Indentured servitude, though lesser known, also has a shameful past. After the emancipation, Southern states sent many black persons to prison on trumped-up charges and then leased them to farms and factories where they were forced to work without pay. That was simply slavery by another name. But the question before us today is not about slavery, and it's not even about indentured servitude, at least of the kind that was practiced 150 years ago. The question this measure raises is whether or not Californians should require felons in state prison to work. Our work requirement in the prisons is certainly a question worthy of debate. Some say we should pay inmates more than the token few cents an hour that they earn today. Others suggest that their working conditions are not always what they should be. But those issues can be addressed through legislation without the sweeping, inflexible permanence of a constitutional amendment. Members, just a few weeks ago, we passed Senate Bill 1371 by the senator from Gardena. It required the Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation to develop a 5-year plan to raise inmate wages. That measure got off the floor 36-2 in a bipartisan vote. What ACA 3 would do is end the requirement in our prisons immediately and then tie the legislature's hand forevermore. Before we pass it, we should be very clear about its impact. Banning the work requirement in our prisons would undermine our rehabilitation programs, make prison more difficult to manage safely, and according to the Department of Finance, add more than $1 billion a year to the cost of running our prison system. It would also cut into the restitution that inmates pay to help victims cope with the effects of crimes committed against them. If a prisoner chooses to not work, the portion of their wages that now goes towards restitution will disappear. And as those practical problems arise, every attempt to address them will be met with litigation. Inmates will sue, claiming their wages are too low, their hours are too high, or that it is unconstitutional to link good time credit and early release to their willingness to work. Members, these are policy issues best suited to discussion and deliberations on this floor. They are not the kind of fundamental questions that should be reserved to the Constitution or punted to the courts. But that is what this measure will do. Let's keep this matter in our own hands and get to work on the difficult challenges of making sure our prisons are run humanely, efficiently, and in a way that leads to the rehabilitation of as many felons as possible. I've had conversations with the author on this measure over the last few weeks, and I've raised this issue of this ambiguity, the problem of this ambiguity and the fact that it's going to be left up to the courts to interpret it, not up to this legislative body. And that the way to cure this constitutional amendment is to be clear about its impacts. So there's no ambiguity, to be clear about its impacts. I shared with her an amendment to the bill. It's a very short amendment that would clear up all the concerns that I've raised this morning. It would say this: as used in this section, involuntary servitude means labor performed against a person's will for the benefit of another and under coercion. Involuntary servitude does not include any rehabilitation activity required of an incarcerated person, including education, vocational training, or behavioral or substance abuse counseling, or any work task required of an incarcerated person that generally benefits the resident of the facility in which the person is incarcerated, such as cooking, cleaning, groundskeeping, and laundry. This is an amendment that would clear up all the concerns about the ambiguity in this constitutional amendment. And I think it would help the measure pass the voters of California who will raise these same questions. If this stops inmates from having to work, what happens now? And this clears it up. So I would urge the author to consider this amendment, but the measure in its current form as it's presented today, unfortunately, is something that I can't support. And respectfully, I will be voting no.
Thank you. Senator Nelson.
Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen of the Senate, I object to the terminology chosen here, involuntary servitude and slavery. That's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about the justice system and justice for victims. And the people of California have repeatedly spoken on this issue. 3 strikes in 1979. Later, Marsy's Law. That when you harm your fellow humans, including serious and violent acts at their peril, there's a consequence. We're going to remove the consequence now. Oh, why? Well, do you think that it's going to be just an elevated wage for inmate labor? Lord, no. Mandatory automatic increases in minimum wage for inmate labor. Now, what is inmate labor about? Well, it's about, 1, improving your skills that you may then be more capable to participate as a citizen in your community when you are indeed released. It has an enormous impact on institutional security. And if you give a darn about that and don't want to have a bunch of Attica riots, you better give this a thought. But what you really better think about is the impact on local government. Oh, this is just a cost to the state correction system. Hardly. You think lawsuits about this are not going to march right out into your local jails? It already has. When we did this terrible realignment several years ago, I predicted, and it didn't happen just in a few weeks, Fresno County was sued. Why? Because the inmate conditions in their jails had to be equated with those in the correctional system under the authority of a federal receiver then and now. Is that what you want to impose on your local government and your communities? Running their jails has to be done this way, and if you're going to do any work, you've got to get paid a minimum wage or whatever that wage is? No. This is about individuals who have harmed their fellow citizens. They are paying the price, which is justice, for the citizens of California and for particularly their victims. Now we're going to thumb their noses at those victims. And we do it here again and again. I'm tired of that. It's time for us to care about victims again instead of criminal offenders who harm people. Now, again, I want to emphasize a point. Used to be, good time credits was 50% for good time. Well, what is good time? Well, that means that you've been behaving, that you've been programming, the things you're supposed to do. No. I know more about this than I think any of you, by far. And I objected to it all my years at the Board of Parole hearings. Objected, why? Because corrections did not require inmates to earn the good time. It was an automatic sentence reduction. Why? So that they could control, the Department of Corrections, inmate population. And if they needed more room at the inn, they just started according more credits for more things. Well, what do credits mean? The credits mean that you went to your AA program or Battered Women's Syndrome program and got it, applied yourself? No. It means you put your bottom down in a seat and sat there for an hour and you got credit. That's injustice. That is not servitude. That is not slavery. Let's not call it that. Inflammatory language has no place in the justice system, ever how you play it. Realize that this bill has enormous consequences for our communities, for our citizens, and particularly for the aggrieved victims who we, by a vote of aye, are thumbing our noses at.
Senator Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members, or Mr. President, sorry. I stand in support of ACA 3, and given the history of why this language is in our Constitution, it is very important to remove it. Now, we would not be the first state to do so. There are a number of states in the last couple of years that have voted to remove the exact same language from their state constitutions. Colorado became the first state when their voters passed the removal of this language in 2018. And there is now on the ballot for 2022, there are measures in Utah, Nebraska, the voters in Alabama removed it in 2020. There are also Vermont, Oregon, and Tennessee, all of them with this issue on their ballot in 2022. Now, permission to read.
Permission granted.
Thank you. On the question of this issue of cost, let me read from you from Governing Magazine, their analysis of Colorado's change, which is basically almost identical to the language we have before us, where Governing Magazine basically states specifically that this vote will not affect the state's prison labor programs. So the fears that we would be forced to, it certainly will change some aspects, though there is nothing in the amendment that requires, for example, minimum wage. And in all of the states that have eliminated this, none have lifted the pay to their incarcerated individuals to, for example, minimum wage. So while there is the fear-mongering around this, I don't think it's appropriate. And I think this is a very important change to make. And with that, I ask for your aye vote.
Thank you. Senator Mann.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have to say this proposed amendment raises questions I really haven't thought about since college, taking philosophy classes, thinking about theories of punishment and rehabilitation. What do we do with those who violate the social contract, who commit crimes against others? In the Constitution, we know that prisoners don't have a full array of constitutional rights. They don't have a full array of First Amendment or Fourth Amendment rights. Yet we do have due process, and that's something I believe strongly in. Treating our inmates fairly is something I believe strongly in. Certainly, I appreciate the intent of the bill of ending involuntary servitude and the horrid history that this country has with relation to that. But I do worry about some of the effects, and I think my colleague from Berkeley's comments here helped assuage some of my concerns. I've never been to a prison. I was elected in 2020. Last year, because of COVID, I've not had the opportunity to visit as a member. And so that's something I plan to do later this year. I have several prison visits scheduled, but I don't know how prisons work. I don't know how the prison labor system works. But I always have concerns when we talk about constitutional amendments. And so I guess I wanted to just ask the author a question. Is it your intent that this bill would, as I think the senator from Berkeley said, would not affect the state's prison labor system, would not affect minimum wage? Is that your understanding of how this bill would operate?
Senator Kamlager, would you accept the question?
Yes.
Go right ahead, Senator Mann.
So it is my understanding that it will not impact that. This simply says that involuntary servitude will be prohibited. It will still be left to this body to legislate, to have discussions with CDCR and CalPIA on regulations, and to hear from them about what they plan to do. And the reality is, they could do nothing. They could do nothing even if this passes. This bill truly is an amendment to go to the voters that will infuse or reintegrate dignity back into the Constitution. Now, I want to be specific because people are asking about wages, okay? Mm-hmm. So incarcerated workers are not employees. By definition, they are not employees, they are workers. As a result, they are excluded from the Fair Labor Standards Act, Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, the National Labor Relations Act, and they are exempt from OSHA coverage. And if that is not enough, if there was state litigation, there is something called the Prison Litigation Reform Act that disallows incarcerated people from having their rights enforced at the federal level, and the federal law preempts state law. So what it might do, and hopefully it will do, is force our prison system to think about conditions that are harming and killing people. In a 4-year period, there were 600 incarcerated worker injuries logged in the state of California. Workers were burned with chemicals, workers were maimed, workers were killed. Their body parts were crushed, they were lacerated, and they were amputated while on a job. This will hopefully force the prison labor system to analyze those injuries and deaths. I can go on, but you have another statement.
Well, I would like to have a dialogue, if we might,
Yes.
which is, I appreciate the sentiment. I understand from what you're saying that you believe the various state laws and practices in place would still apply. And that, I think, is my main concern with this is one could read your amendment, and there is an interpretation, which I guess is not the interpretation of the other 9 states so far that has been taken, that this amendment, should it be approved by the voters, would end all practices related to the state prison labor system. And so I just want to be clear that I understand what you're saying as saying that the intent of this bill would not be to end the existing practices with regards to the state prison labor program, that we would still, as a legislature, be able to legislate different labor practices in the prisons without violating a constitutional amendment. Because if this is passed, then it is the law of the land, the law of the state of California, and we cannot, as a body, legislate something that is unconstitutional. So what I want to be clear of is what the intent and interpretation of this amendment should be. And I gather from your statements, and you can just, I don't even know if this is a question. I guess I will phrase it as a question. Is it correct then, should I take it from your statements, that you believe that this body can still legislate state prison labor practices, that existing practices and laws will still apply to state inmates, or will this end the prison labor program as one could interpret?
Senator Kamlager, you
Through the
accept
chair,
question.
I will just say this is not going to end the prison labor system.
Okay.
Involuntary servitude, by definition, is coercing someone to work for the benefit of someone else. What is not being discussed is that there are incarcerated people, they want to work. People want to work, they want to gain skills, they want to rehabilitate, they want to take classes, they want to earn credits. In all of my time doing this work, I have never talked to someone who has said, I don't want to work. That is not what people say. What they say is, I don't want to die. I want to have the ability to take classes. I want to have the ability to work on an assignment where I can earn credits. That is still going to be allowed. The other reality is, and let's just be clear, is that prison labor benefits dozens of private companies and incentivizes them to lobby us to make sure that we are passing laws that will allow this prison labor system to continue. Let's be clear. Let's also be clear that the state earns money off of this labor workforce. We have a company that we contract with through CalPIA, and 45% of their workforce are incarcerated workers. This is not going to end that. This is not implying, and that is not what involuntary servitude is. And I might be taking a long time saying this, but I want it to be clear. The fear is that people will say, I don't have to work. And I will also add that this body passed a law a few years ago, AB 2056, I believe, Assemblymember Weber's bill. AB 2590, which codifies that CDCR must be rehabilitative in nature. There has also been lawsuits that have been successfully argued when folks have said, oh, this means incarcerated workers don't have to work. And it has been taken to court. and they have been struck down because the law says that prison time is not primarily economic in nature. It is penological and it is social. So there are so many stopgaps that we have written into law in this state and in other states across the country that still will keep the work in process. It will, what we are hoping with this amendment is that people will think about what involuntary servitude, what indentured servitude means, and will say that we don't want it in our Constitution. With 26 other states that don't have it in their Constitution, that still have active carceral systems where people are still working.
So I will just state, I think if I had just heard, so first of all, on the question of abuses, I certainly agree, and I think we should legislate away workplace abuses. There's a lot of things that we as a body should do. I do have concerns about a constitutional amendment that I'm still very unclear as to the effect of. If you had just said that we will follow the practice and the interpretation of this should be the same as with the other 9 states, I would have been happy to vote for this. I only note that somebody who is in state prison is already in involuntary imprisonment because they've committed a crime, a breach of the social contract. I don't understand what it means when we're talking about ending involuntary servitude. I didn't understand what the impacts of this bill will be, and I have concerns about voting for a constitutional amendment that I don't understand. And that is my concern, so I will unfortunately be laying off the bill today.
Thank you. Senator Unvar.
Thank you, Mr. President. A question of the author,
Senator Kamlager, would you accept the question?
Yes.
and I'm hoping that this has already been said, but just to clarify for legislative intent purposes, should ACA 3 be passed by the voters, inmates would still be required to, for example, clean their cells, bust their dishes, clean common areas. That would not be prohibited, would it?
Like to respond?
Yes, that would not be prohibited because taking care of your cell is not work. That is a social agreement that you make while you're living with other people. You're not earning wages because you are making sure that your house is in order. So
Alrighty,
I
thank
hope
you.
that answered your question.
That does, thank you.
Senator Aller.
Well, I've been listening very intently to the discussion. It was my understanding this bill was going to come up next week, and I guess I'm very, very open to voting for something like this. I am certainly concerned about the Department of Finance's projections that this is going to lead to a $1.5 billion annual cost to our budget. That really worries me, given all of the priorities and needs that we have that are out there, from transportation to healthcare to programs for disadvantaged people. So that's my outstanding challenge. I thought that some issues were being worked out between the Elections and Constitutional Amendments chair and the author. It seems that they've fallen apart. And so I thought that was in process, and now the bill is up for a vote. So I want to get more clarity on the state of that negotiation, but I do want to say that I agree with nearly every single thing the author has said. And I'm very open to voting for this. I just am concerned about where the negotiations are between the author and the chair.
Is that a question for the author? No. All right. Senator Roth, I'm sorry.
That's okay, Mr. President. I'm the cellophane man. You know, I think my voting record on these issues over the last 10 years is pretty good. I am concerned about, and frankly, I didn't know this was coming up either, and I'm reading it on the fly. So maybe I'm all off. And I'm not even a lawyer anymore, best I can tell, but when I was, I sort of thought that we looked at things with through the lens of the plain language. And when you talk about involuntary servitude, and I don't care which definition you try to pull up on your phone in the 45 seconds that I had to do it, involuntary means against your will, and servitude is work. And for me, it means when you are forced or coerced to engage in work against your will. And work to me is whether you're cleaning your cell or you're bussing up your tray at the dining hall or doing anything else, you potentially have a problem. And it's the involuntary piece and it's the work piece inside the wire that bothers me. Because that's what happens in prison for a whole variety of reasons. For inmates who choose not to engage in educational efforts or the rehabilitation that we hopefully are now providing for them at a higher level than we have been over the last 10 years, you provide inmates and you require inmates to do some work for a variety of reasons. One of the most important ones is good order and discipline inside the wire, where you have people who are forced to be there for a good reason after conviction, and there are a lot of them, less so now than perhaps 10 years ago, but to have individuals who are not actively engaged in productive work, idle hands, you know what they say. And so that's what my concern is. For me, cost is not the issue. Individuals who work should be paid. And if our pay rates are too low in the CDCR system, they should be increased. And I'm all for that. I'm concerned about the interpretation, and someone for sure will be interpreting the 2 sentences or 1 sentence that's in this ACA at some point in time. And if the interpretation ultimately is involuntary servitude, is in fact the way I read it, which is you cannot force anyone to work against their will, period, stop, end of sentence, then I think potentially we have a serious issue inside the wire at facilities up and down the state of California. And I don't know how to address that, ma'am. And if there's an opportunity to have a further conversation about this, I hope we can. I'm going to keep thinking about it in the 30 further seconds I have before they call this matter for a vote, but I am very, very, very concerned. I do appreciate your work. I have the utmost respect for all that you have done and continue to do in this legislature, but I think we have some issues with this. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Borges.
Mr. President, I have a procedural question. I don't know to whom I should address this. Maybe Bernie or the author perhaps, but maybe through the president. May I pose a question?
Parliamentary inquiry. Go right ahead.
I think that would be appropriate. When the legislature pushes forward a bill to put before the voters an item, does legislative intent still carry over, or is it the intent of the drafters of the bill before the voters?
That's a legislative council question. And we'd have to contact them for an answer.
Okay. The reason I ask, and maybe it may not be a perfect corollary, but there were legislative bills that allowed items to go to the voters, one of which was, for example, water infrastructure. And the legislative intent at the time was that certain projects were going to be identified by virtue of agreement, but they weren't memorialized in the ballot initiative itself. And so when people brought that issue up, it was the legislative intent at the time, but it had no force of law or force of interpretation through the courts. If that is accurate, and I'll let Ledge Counsel opine at some point, I suspect, even though it's not here now, it seems like legislative intent on this issue might become completely irrelevant if this matter goes before the voters, and how it's constructed will be the primary legal authority on that issue. And I didn't know if, maybe had anybody who has knowledge on this might be willing to offer a comment.
Thank you. Senator Grove.
Thank you, Mr. President. Question of the author.
Senator Kamlager, will you accept the question?
Yes.
You will. Go right ahead.
So right now, the California State Constitution specifies that involuntary servitude is prohibited with the exception of punishment of a crime. Is it your intent, or is it the intent of the proponent of this bill to have those that are serving a prison sentence be classified as, you mentioned injuries. The reason why I'm asking this is because you mentioned about injuries, maiming, things like that. Would they be under the DIR, Department of Fair Employment and Housing, Department of Labor Standards Enforcement? Would they be under those CalOSHA protections? Is that the legislative or the intent of the SCA? Or ACA, sorry.
Choose to answer that. Senator Kamlager.
Yes, thank you for the question. The answer is no. They would not be protected under any of those laws. They would not be covered under any of those protections. By definition and in law, incarcerated workers are not employees.
So I guess my question is, and I think the opposition is raising that there's a lot of broad language in it, because the Constitution specifically says now, without this ACA, that involuntary servitude is prohibited except with the punishment of a crime. And so the purpose of the ACA is to include those serving in a punishment of a crime into what category then?
The purpose of the bill really is to take this phrase, which is incredibly potent and historical and dehumanizing, out of the state constitution. The precedent that we have are 26 other states that also do not have this phrase, do not have this clause in their constitution, and still have robust, working carceral systems in their state where prison labor is going on. I have to assure you that there are not lawsuits happening in those states where incarcerated individuals are not working. This is not about having people not work. And so I'm trying to be more succinct, but I'm hoping that that also answers your question.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you for responding. You know, I appreciate the author's heart. I serve with her on rules, and I know that she has a deep heart for criminal justice reform. I know I talked to you about the bill. I know it's been voted on by some of my colleagues in the past committees. I have to respectfully rise in opposition because I truly feel that the state constitution specifies clearly, whether it's historical or not, involuntary servitude is prohibited except in the punishment of a crime. And I think if there were amendments taken, the amendments that were offered earlier, it would clarify that and give us a little more ease that it's not going to be something that will just allow prison inmates that are serving, that are being punished for a crime against humanity, or an individual, a human being, that they still have to do the things. They have to clean their room. They have to work in the kitchen. They have to work in the laundry. They have to work in, they don't have to. They can and get good time off and good time behavior credits. And I asked you about that because that was a concern of mine too. I think they should be able to get good time credits if they do the work and they do change their ways. But I think this is very broad, and I do encourage you to work with our colleague that stood up and asked for the amendment. I'm Senator Glazer because I can't remember where he's from. I apologize. But I do encourage you to work with him on this amendment because I think that would clarify it and give a lot of us ease to help support this. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Senator Dodd is not at his desk. Senator Mann.
I apologize for getting up a second time. As I said earlier, my main concerns are about what this amendment means. And in the course of this discussion, I received several texts stating that this is the case law with respect to the bill. One, for people serving criminal sentences, servitude means work that does not serve a rehabilitative purpose or fall within the so-called housekeeping exception for chores such as cleaning one's own living area and common areas. Two, servitude is considered involuntary if the refusal to perform it can result in punishment, such as the revocation of custody credits or the imposition of solitary confinements. Three, servitude will not be considered involuntary if the only consequences of refusal to perform it are the denial of benefits such as wages or the opportunity to earn custody credits. Is this your understanding of the case law and how this amendment would be interpreted? That's a question of the author.
Senator Kamlager, will you accept the question?
I can't speak to what the courts will opine.
Second question to the author, if I might.
Will you
Is
accept
that your
another question
interpretation of
from
this?
Senator Kamlager, will you accept another question?
Yes.
Is that the interpretation that we should take this amendment as having? And I only ask that because I want to vote for this bill. I want to vote for this amendment. But I also want to be clear that we're not opening up a can of worms here that might upend our present labor system. Now, that is my main concern here. So
I just have to say that I'm wondering how my words have not been clear. This amendment, if passed by the voters, would not eradicate the prison labor system. I wish that is something we were in a space to talk about, but it is not. I think it would be encouraging, actually, for folks to visit the prisons to see, and hopefully not on a prearranged visit where everything is shined and buffed and pretty, but to have real conversations about what is going on. And I don't think you are going to find people who are going to say, I don't want to work. I think what you are going to find is people saying, I want to earn good time credits. I want to have a certain assignment. The intent behind the bill is not to get rid of the prison labor system. I also want to say, we have so many amendments, which I tried to discuss in my opening. We are not overly prescriptive with what prohibiting unreasonable searches and seizures look like in the Constitution. It gets prescribed in law. We are not overly prescriptive about what a jury of your peers looks like. That is further described in law. We are not overly prescriptive about what freedom of the press looks like. That is prescribed and discussed in law. So I'm wondering why we're trying to negotiate what freedom looks like. And it doesn't mean freedom to do whatever you want, but it certainly means what a cousin to slavery is still doing in the California State Constitution. But if you take your job seriously in this body, I implore you to immediately, upon the adjournment, to consider legislation about working conditions inside the prisons. I implore you to actively engage with CalPIA and CDCR, because it is so lazy to have an analysis that says we have to oppose involuntary servitude because it could cost $1.5 billion annually. The costs of operating our judicial systems so that we give people due process costs far more than $1.5 billion annually, and we work really hard to make sure that due process is in place. This is not about getting rid of a labor industry. It's evident we're not prepared to discuss that. This is about taking out a phrase in the constitutional amendment that would then allow this to go to the voters. And you can decide how you interpret it for the constituents that you talk to between now and November. But if there are 26 other states in this country, even in the South, that don't have this clause and still have an active prison labor industry, that should give you some relief if you are fearful that people won't want to work. What the intent for me is that maybe it would mean people are slightly more adequately trained on how to use equipment before they use it without any instructions and have to have their arms amputated. And I don't think we should take these examples as outliers to what's going on. I think it means that if you say, I would like to do X job, and the prison employee says no, that you're not then thrown into the shoe or taken credits away or having your visitation taken away. That's what it should mean. In our county facilities, if you work and you do a good job, you are given a trustee status. Do you know what trustee status means? Trustee status means that you're able to eat the same meal that the deputies get, and the deputies eat that meal for free. It means you don't have to eat the slop. And maybe it would mean that if you are working, then you're kept away from bullies and predators that are in the prison with you. So why do we only have to look at this through the lens of wages rather than the other very real and hazardous and deadly and debilitating and dehumanizing conditions that are also happening and very present in our prisons? I just ask that people are more imaginative about what is really going on in our prisons and how people truly are treated. And really, if you want to get dark about it, keep your workforce alive and healthy so they can continue to work. That is the true nature of capitalism.
Senator Dodd.
Yes, Mr. President, members. I've listened very carefully. I mean, this too was just, I feel like we are blindsided on the floor on this today. I've not had any substantive discussions with my staff, any experts, on this issue. After listening to all sides, I do applaud the author for, coming forward with the bill, but I still see that there are interpretation. It's a big deal. People interpret things differently every single day. At this point in time, I think the good senator from Orinda has come up with some amendments that I feel are very, very fair and clarify it. So there's not a lot of different interpretation on what we're passing out of this House, let alone what all the voters are going to be thinking they're going to be voting on, because we know that they don't read the ballot initiative language anyway. So I think we're going to do ourselves and our voters a better service by accepting these amendments. Otherwise, I will not be voting on this today. Thank you.
Senator Skinner.
Thank you, Mr. President and members. It's unfortunate that the debate has become as, I think, confusing as it has on the floor. This is the removal of a few words in our Constitution. Those states that do not have these words still have circumstances in their prisons where if a person does not comply by the rules, that person can have privileges taken away and punished. So if the rules are that you must clean your cell, you will clean your cell or you will have punishment. And there is nothing about the removal of these words that would remove that. Now, our senator from Irvine read in effect, the canons of law that the courts have upheld in a whole variety of cases, and what he read was accurate. Now, the author did also accurately answer that she cannot predict exactly how future courts may act. None of us can. But certainly, if we take court actions to date and interpretations of practices in every other state that either has or does not have this clause, what he read is accurate. So the fear that if our voters were to remove these words from our Constitution, the fear that our prison system could not require our incarcerated individuals to follow rules is wrong, and the fear that our prison system would not have different mechanisms to, in effect, hold people accountable if they did not participate in rehabilitative programs is also incorrect. Now, there are some things that may end up being changed as a result due to certain lawsuits, and maybe those are such things as the safety of practices. But it would not be either, at least if we look at those states that have removed this, and for example, Colorado, where there have been lawsuits where certain people have asserted that the removal of these words in Colorado's law meant that all prisoners had to be employees and get minimum wage. All of those have been struck down so far by the courts. So I, of course, I do not know what all of the concerns that the members here may have, but so far the ones that have been expressed on the floor have not held up in any other state. Or so, in other words, if we take court action to date and legal precedent to date, we would be safely removing this from our Constitution with minimal impact to our prison system. And I ask for a vote.
Thank you. Any further discussion or debate on this item? Seeing no more mics up, Senator Kamlager, would you like to close?
Yes, thank you. We have passed so many constitutional amendments on this body, dealing with women's rights. We have passed dealing with children's rights and their protections. We have passed laws about athletes and how they should be treated and perceived. We have passed laws in this House about folks with immigrant status and how they should be treated in the state of California. We have even taken up laws that decide whether or not drivers are employees or not. We have taken up laws around smoking and who should smoke and what's permissible. And many of these have also found their way to the courts. But we voted for them because it was principle, out of principle. I am so grateful that so many mics went up wanting clarification on what involuntary servitude means. I ask that you continue to not disassociate it from slavery. I don't know how you can parse out a justification about the two. I suspect that this conversation we had on this floor was very similar to the discussions had in 1800 about freeing the slaves. And even people in that body who hated Black people, who were not abolitionists, even they decided that it was important for the country to abolish slavery for very different reasons. But I suspect our founding fathers parsed out every word to figure out how to maintain the status quo and to pass something that makes them feel good. I don't want to make you feel good. I don't want to negotiate what involuntary servitude means. I don't want to go there. I think it is important to not be prescriptive, because if you're overly prescriptive, you actually leave out certain things. You bind the hands of the court when cases come before them. And you know that courts are overly cautious. And they will say, well, if it was the one thing that was not specifically articulated, then this will not be law. And that is why we have so many cases that come before our judicial system. I mentioned that California was a plantation state because a plantation is a colony where crops are cultivated using resident labor. And we contract with so many companies using our labor workforce to do this work. We have alfalfa farming, software coding, we make refrigerators, we make disability placards, we make Victoria's Secret underwear, we make McDonald's uniforms, we make Starbucks holiday products, we grind meat, and we package milk, all in our state prisons, so that we're able to buy these at a cheaper cost. Incarcerated workers earn between 4 cents and 37 cents an hour unless they work for CAL FIRE. And of that money, 20% goes to room and board, 20% goes to restitution and fines, and if they don't have any restitution fees, 20% of it goes just for programming for victims of crime. 20% goes into a little trust. What they buy at the canteen is marked up by 65%, greater than any tax we complain about on this floor, to cover administrative costs. California is able to run because we operate this plantation. And no one, not even I, is strong enough on my own to defeat that. That is not what this amendment is about. In closing, I just want to say I went to the synagogue over the weekend and talked about the B'Tselem Elohim, which says we are free from bondage and created in God's image. Thinking about this closing yesterday, I thought about my mother in the play The Grapes of Wrath, which was about poverty and homelessness and the Depression and the average man who had his land taken from him. And there was a quote that Steinbeck wrote in his book, that if you are in trouble, you go to poor people, because at the end of the day, it is the poor people that will help you. I believe that our Constitution is about principles, guiding principles and values. I believe that we are all created in God's image. I believe even if we are incarcerated, we still should have dignity. I believe that even if we are incarcerated, that we should be free from bondage of demoralization and dehumanization. I authored this because I believe that dignity is our birthright, and we shouldn't be denied it because of our race, our gender, our religion, our party affiliation, or even because we are incarcerated. I hope that you will not see this or interpret this in a way that will upend the entire state of California when it hasn't been done in any of the other states across this land as it relates to this issue. I asked for your vote on ACA 3, which would take involuntary servitude out of the California state constitution.
Thank you. All discussion and debate having ceased, Madam Secretary, please call the roll on file item 99.
Allen, Archuleta, Atkins, Bates, Becker, I. Borges, Bradford, I. Caballero, Cortese, I. Dally, Dodd, Durazo, I. Eggman, I. Glazer, no. Gonzalez, I. Grove, no. Hertzberg, I. Hueso, Hurtado, Jones, Kamlager, I. Laird, I. Leyva, I. Limon, I. McGuire, I. Melendez, Min? Newman? I. Nielsen? No. Ochoa Bogue? Pan? I. Portantino? I. Roth? Rubio? Skinner? I. Stern? I. Umberg? I. Wachowski? Weiner? I. Wilk?
Secretary, please call the absent members.
Allen? Archuleta? Atkins? Bates? Borges? Caballero? Dally? No. Dodd? Hueso? Hurtado? Jones? Melendez? Min? Ochoa Bogue? No. Roth? Rubio? I. Wachowski? Wilk? No.
Ayes 20, noes 6. The measure fails. Motion to reconsider, Senator Kamlager. Is there objection to reconsideration? Reconsideration is granted. Ayes 37, no 0. I'm sorry. Ayes 34, no 0 on reconsideration of ACA 3. All right, members, now we're returning to motions and resolutions.